right now on Matter of Fact. 30 million people across the country are one step closer to losing their health insurance.
You know, if you're going to wipe the protections of pre-existing conditions out the book, you're going to impact people like my son.
How dismantling Obamacare would affect everyone and maybe change the course of the midterms. And the House is finally ready to vote on immigration reform. Can the bills really pass?
It's time to stop using immigrants as political footballs and to stop kicking immigrants around.
Or are they just a political stunt? Plus, what you learned in school about the Civil War is wrong.
This war is not as simple as people would like to make it.
Meet the woman with the job of challenging your views about the Union and the Confederacy.
Soledad O'Brien. Welcome to Matter of Fact. This week, GOP leader Paul Ryan is planning to bring two competing immigration bills to a vote. He's hoping to diffuse a brewing fight within his own party. One faction that wants an immigration crackdown, another faction of moderate Republicans that want legal status for so-called dreamers, the undocumented immigrants who came to this country as children. We told you a few weeks ago that moderates in the party were planning a Queen of the Hill vote, an obscure procedure that would have forced a vote on DACA. This action on immigration comes as the Trump administration is cracking down on illegal immigration and promising to prosecute anyone who enters the country illegally, imposing new limits on who can get asylum in this country and separating children from their parents at the border. Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington State became one of the very first members of Congress to meet with a group of asylum-seeking mothers whose children were taken from them at the border. It's so nice to have you back with us.
It's so great to be back with you.
So some of what we've seen and heard has been so horrific, frankly. Yeah. Talk to me about where you were and what you saw.
Well, we heard that there had been 206, well, we didn't know exactly how many, but over 200 individuals who were transferred from the Texas border to a federal prison just south of Seattle. 174 of the 206 were women. The others were men. I did not meet with the men. I hope to go back and do that. They were all asylum seekers, or largely asylum seekers. About half of them had children that had been forcibly removed from them.
They were describing to you what it was like to have a child literally taken out, a baby taken out of your arms. Can you tell me some of the stories that the women shared with you?
Yeah, all of them described never being able to say goodbye to their child. So they talked about things like they were in the same room as their children, and then they were told that they were going to be taken out for a photograph or be taken to court. And then when they came back, their children were no longer there. And they literally, in some cases, were in a room right next door to where their children were being held, so they could hear their children screaming for them. Never got a chance to say goodbye, to explain. Children as young as one, Soledad, I mean, 1 year old.
So when people say, hey, listen, by taking away children from their parents, we're trying to send a message, don't come.
Well, that's illegal. You know, they've been trying to walk back some of those statements, but they're all over the press. But the Trump administration has made it clear that this is a deterrent. And in fact, some of the women told me that
even if you have a valid asylum claim.
Even if you have a valid asylum claim, it is absolutely illegal, and the courts have ruled on this, to hold people simply for deterrence purposes. And that's what they're doing.
What are the conversations that you have with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle about this? Because really, you don't hear a lot from Republican members of Congress defending this policy, which I think really does have the voting public up in arms.
We have jurisdiction over immigration. We've had no hearings on this. And you know what happened when I started talking about this is everyone looked very uncomfortable, and then everyone except the chairman left. It was an empty slate of chairs on the Republican side. I said, I know there are good colleagues on the other side, mothers and fathers, who are not going to be able to go home at night and tell their children why they didn't stand up and say anything. But unfortunately, that's all I'm hearing is dead silence from them. You're right, not a lot of standing up for the policy, but also not speaking out to end it. And that's what needs to happen right now.
How do you think it plays into the midterm elections? It might be a shrinking minority of a base, and yet it's powerful and easily motivated, and this is a hot button issue, and it sends people to the polls.
I will say I think it also revs up our base. And in polling that I've seen and that we have done ourselves in swing districts across the country, I think Republicans have to be very, very careful.
So do the Dems have to wait till the day they take back the House to work on immigration reform?
Well, we have solutions. I mean, specifically around family separation. We have bills around detention reform. We have bills around Dreamers. We have bills around immigration reform. The reality is that since we don't control the floor of the House or the Senate, we can't even get those bills heard. But I think it's important for us not to just be an opposition party, which we are in the minority, but also to be a proposition party and to say, this is our vision of the country. This is what we see. Put the bills out there, build the support for them with the public, and then ultimately, when we take control, be able to pass those bills.
Congressman Jayapal, nice to have you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Soledad.
Next on Matter of Fact, should they stay or should they go?
The statues, they don't have the same power for me. I understand the environment in which these things were built.
Meet the woman in charge of helping Richmond figure out what to do with its Confederate monuments. Plus, why one Republican lawmaker says he's fed up with Democrats and even his own party.
It's about the American people who suffer. Why this town plays this game of power politics.
Plus, he's on a mission to commit random acts of kindness in all 50 states. Can he pull it off?
It's been almost 1 year since a white supremacist rally turned deadly in Charlottesville, Virginia. Organizers were upset over plans to remove statues of Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson from a local park. Today, more than 750 Confederate monuments dot the landscape of America, mostly in the South. Richmond, Virginia is the former capital of the Confederacy, and it's wrestling with how to reconcile that past, specifically what to do with statues lining Monument Avenue. A commission is expected to release its recommendations soon. The co-chair of that commission also happens to run the Civil War Museum in Richmond, and she's African-American. Our correspondent, Jessica Gomez, sat down with Christy Coleman, who says the issue is not just black and white.
Unlocking the stories of the past. It's a passion for Christy Coleman, CEO of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Deep inside the museum's vault, pieces of history. Here, mostly Confederate history.
They're used to it now, but when I first got here, that was, I think, one of the headlines. You know, African-American woman takes over Civil War Museum. I said, okay, here we go. Here we go.
Just a few years into the job, there were more headlines after a proposal to merge the museum with the nearby Museum of the Confederacy.
Let's head into the state dining room.
The museum, which included the White House of the Confederacy, had a fiercely loyal following, but was struggling financially. Former investment banker and Civil War history buff Waite Rawls was at the helm.
If you try to raise money for the history of the Confederacy, you're barking up the wrong alley. It's not going to work. You have to get the Confederacy into the full context of the period.
Rawls liked the idea of the merger and liked Christy.
She's female, I'm not. I've got all these ancestors who fought in the Civil War. She doesn't. She's African American, I'm not. Put the two of us together, and now you've got these multiple perspectives that bring the history to life for people without saying, you're right, you're wrong.
The museums were merged. Construction is now underway to house the artifacts from both museums in a 28,000 square foot space. When completed next year, it'll be the second largest Civil War museum in the country after Gettysburg.
We wanted to elicit a response. We wanted people to see something that would strike them to their core.
But there was a price for progress. Nearly half of the Confederacy Museum's members went away. Not before the angry calls and letters.
I have no wish to fully explore the so-called colored, Negro, Black, or African American experience. I do not approve of Christy Coleman. So that's where we are.
But the mayor of Richmond does approve of Coleman, appointing her co-chair of the commission, tasked with deciding what to do with the city's Confederate monuments. Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, Jefferson Davis, and others. In the former capital of the Confederacy, passions over the past flaring up once again.
They're taking my statues down, but y'all let them keep putting their statues up.
If these statues are heritage, then your heritage is hate.
What we find is less than 20% want them completely removed. Less than 20% want them to stay exactly as they are. The majority have some really interesting dynamics along the way.
Proposals include adding context, descriptions near the monuments, or perhaps even erecting additional statues.
I think what's happening is healthy for this community. Frankly, when I look at the statues, they don't have the same power for me. I understand them and the environment in which these things were built. But for people who have a truly visceral, emotional reaction to all of this, you can't discount that either.
Whatever happens next, Coleman says, will determine the next chapter in Richmond's rich history.
If we can't understand this American crisis and trauma and how it all came together, we cannot be what we were intended to be. That's why it's important. That's why I still do what I do.
In Richmond, Virginia, for Matter of Fact, I'm Jessica Gomez.
It's unclear if the city has the authority to remove the Richmond statues because state law makes it illegal to remove war memorials. A separate lawsuit filed in Charlottesville has temporarily put a stop to that city's effort to remove the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues.
When we come back, 20 states are suing to strike down Obamacare.
And they just got a big assist from the Trump administration.
Are you one of the 30 million people who could lose health coverage? And why did nearly 1 million American jobs move to this country?
A new poll shows that health care is the top issue for voters going into the midterm elections. It ranks higher than the economy, jobs, guns, taxes, and immigration. But there's still a push to repeal the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. 20 states are suing to strike down the law, and they just got a big assist from the Trump administration. The Department of Justice says it will not defend the ACA in court. The states argue that since Congress eliminated the penalty for not purchasing insurance, the rest of the ACA is now unconstitutional. The DOJ agreed and said if the mandate is out, well, so should protections for people with pre-existing conditions. If this lawsuit is successful, more than 30 million people could lose their health care. Republican Congressman Tom Reed represents the 23rd District of upstate New York. It's nice to have you with us, sir.
Thank you, Soledad.
So you have been a very big Trump supporter, and early on in first, somebody described it to me as ride or die for President Trump. And you've also been very aggressive in efforts to get rid of the ACA with other legislation, but you're opposed to this lawsuit. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, no, I think what the lawsuit represents, if they're attacking the pre-existing condition, is something I don't support. And I understand the constitutional argument, and what we're dealing with is a case coming through the Texas court up through the process. And it reaffirms to me that we need to deal with this issue. Healthcare is not going away. We need to legislatively come up with solutions to the problems of healthcare. And that's where the work we're doing in the Problem Solvers Caucus, for example, where I co-chair on the Republican side, 24 members, 24 Democratic members and Republican members who come together and put together proposals to solve problems. And we did this on the individual marketplace in healthcare. That's the type of effort I'm more supportive of. Let's go through the process of legislating and engage the American people in an honest debate. As I travel the country, I hear the exact same concerns echoed by our folks of Western New York. Costs continue to go through the roof. Healthcare costs and then correspondingly health insurance costs go up. We need to come to solutions that are going to drive these costs down.
But if there's an effort to get rid of the protections for people with pre-existing conditions, I think it would be devastating politically, not counting people who are on Medicare. There are 300,000 people in your district who have pre-existing conditions. Obviously, that's an estimate. How have they been talking to you about how they feel about this? And how much are you concerned politically?
Well, I never really put politics first. I mean,
you would be the only elected official I've ever met in the 30 years that I've been in this business, sir.
I appreciate that. Well, thank you. So
You're at number one. Let me write that down.
But it's really about solving problems for people. I mean, I'm the father of a type 1 diabetic. Diagnosed at 4, is now 18, going off to college. You know, if you're going to wipe the protections of pre-existing conditions out the book, you're going to impact people like my son. And I get that. That is why this is not the path to take in regards to removing the pre-existing condition.
What are your predictions in terms of the midterm elections if, in fact, the messaging is around, hey, if you have a pre-existing condition and this lawsuit goes forward, there's a really good chance that you're not going to be able to get health care?
I don't agree with that conclusion.
You don't?
Because given the nature of the case and how it has to go through the court process, that is not an outcome that's going to impact the midterm election.
So it's just because it won't be resolved?
Correct.
It won't be adjudicated. You don't think the messaging around it will be problematic?
Politically, this town,
they
are going to spin everything.
This town only exists for politics.
They're going to spin everything, Soledad, and it's going to be Democrats saying they have everything figured out and that they should be in control, and Republicans will continue to fight for our position in the power base. And to be honest with you, I'm sick and tired of that. And that's why I'm trying to be a voice of saying it's not about who has power. It's about the American people. It's about the American people who suffer why this town plays this game of power politics. And I'm sick and tired of that too. That's why I co-chair the Problem Solvers Caucus. That's why I'm willing to embrace and engage in some very contentious, honest disagreements, because we need to do more of that.
Congressman Reed, it's so nice to have you. Thanks for talking with us.
It's great to be with you. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Coming up next, is America losing more jobs to free trade agreements or technology? We're separating fact from fiction. Plus 50 yards, 50 states. Why this man is on a mission to mow lawns across the country.
Now to a weekly feature we like to call We're Paying Attention Even If You're Too Busy. Before Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his country would fight back against U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, talks to rework NAFTA were already on the rocks, with President Trump reportedly frustrated that negotiations have stretched on for 10 months. NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, is a lengthy and complex treaty between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which allows goods to flow across the borders without tariffs or taxes. Before NAFTA, the cost of the tariff was passed on to you, the consumer. NAFTA essentially eliminated most tariffs, making imported goods cheaper to buy. But the agreement also made it easier for U.S. companies to relocate to other countries. President Ronald Reagan laid the framework for NAFTA in the early 1980s. President George H.W. Bush signed NAFTA in 1992. Both chambers of Congress approved the agreement in 1993, while President Bill Clinton was in office, and he became the president to sign it into law. President Trump has called NAFTA the worst trade deal in history and blames it for the loss of manufacturing jobs. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that America lost about 800,000 jobs to Mexico between 1997 and 2013. But a bipartisan report from Congress, published in 2015, says America has lost more jobs to machines and automation than to Mexico.
When we return, Rodney Smith is on a mission to mow 50 lawns in 50 states.
We think this is an awesome grassroots effort to pay it forward.
Is your state next?
One man is hoping to change the world one lawn at a time. His name is Rodney Smith, and he's traveling around the country mowing lawns for the elderly, disabled, for single moms, and for veterans. Smith calls it the 50-yard challenge because he plans to cut one lawn in all 50 states. He started on May 17th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and since then he's made it to 26 more states. He's going to add 2 more this weekend in Louisiana and Arkansas. This is Smith's second year completing the 50-yard challenge. He says he's doing it to inspire kids to get involved in community service. He takes kids along as he cuts grass and then encourages them to start their own challenges. This year, 130 kids have signed up, We think this is an awesome grassroots effort to pay it forward. I'm Soledad O'Brien, and we'll see you back here next week for Matter of Fact.